Alaska dropped hundreds of bears into an empty valley and accidentally created one of the most successful wildlife experiments in history. What happened next wasn't just unexpected. It rewrote everything scientists thought they knew about ecosystems. So how did a bunch of relocated predators turn a barren landscape into a thriving wilderness? Stick around, because this story gets wild. Let's rewind to 1944. World War II is raging, and Alaska's got bigger problems than you'd think. Not the Japanese. Not the cold. Bears. Specifically brown bears with an attitude problem and zero respect for property lines. The Aleutian Islands, and parts of mainland Alaska, had become a war zone, and not just because of the fighting. Military bases popped up like mushrooms after rain, airfields, supply depots, thousands of troops. And the bears, they treated these installations like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Trash bins were appetizers. Supply tents were the main course. One base reported a bear walking into the mess hall like it owned the place. Spoiler alert, it kind of did. The military solution? Shoot them. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Turns out, killing apex predators in massive numbers has consequences. Who knew? By 1950, bear populations in certain areas had crashed. Not extinct, but close enough to make wildlife officials very nervous. Enter the Alaska Department of Fish and Game with an idea that sounded absolutely insane. Take bears from areas where they're thriving. Drop them in places where they've been wiped out. Let nature do its thing. Simple, right? Except nothing about this was simple. The target location was a valley system in south-central Alaska. We're talking remote. The kind of remote where your GPS gives up and suggests carrier pigeon as a backup. Roughly 800 square miles of pristine wilderness, mountains, rivers, forests, and almost zero large predators. The bears were gone. The wolves were gone. Even the wolverines had called it quits. But here's where it gets interesting. This valley wasn't empty of life. Far from it. Salmon runs still happened every year. Berries grew like weeds. Small mammals were everywhere. This place should have been crawling with predators. Instead, nothing. It was like showing up to a feast and realizing you're the only guest. Scientists had a theory. Remove the top predators, and the whole system goes sideways. They called it a trophic cascade. Fancy term for a domino effect that starts at the top of the food chain and crashes all the way down. Think of it like removing the manager from a restaurant. Sure, the cooks are still there. The waiters still show up. But without someone running the show? Chaos. The plan was ambitious. Between 1950 and 1958, wildlife officers would capture brown bears from coastal areas, tranquilize them, and airlift them into this valley system. Helicopters weren't exactly common back then, so they made do with small planes and a lot of nerve. Picture strapping a 600-pound drug bear into a cargo net and flying it over mountains. OSHA would have had a field day. The first drop happened in spring of 1950. 12 bears, 6 males, 6 females, all adults, all extremely confused. They released them near the valley's main river system, figuring the salmon runs would keep them fed while they figured out their new zip code. And then, nothing. For weeks, nothing happened. The bears scattered. Some headed for higher elevations. Others stuck near the river. Wildlife officers monitored from a distance, but honestly, they had no idea if this would work. This wasn't like introducing goldfish to a pond. These were apex predators capable of ripping car doors off. The first sign of success came 6 months later. One of the females was spotted with cubs. 2 of them, tiny, fuzzy, and proof that at least some of these bears decided the valley wasn't a terrible place to raise a family. Over the next 2 years, more cubs appeared. The population was growing, but slowly. By 1952, they estimated around 30 bears in the valley. Not exactly a wildlife explosion. Yet, here's where the story takes a turn. Because it wasn't just about the bears. Remember that trophic cascade? That domino effect? It was about to kick in hard. Before the bears showed up, the salmon runs in this valley were decent but not spectacular. Salmon would swim upstream, spawn, die, and that was it. Their bodies would drift downstream or get picked apart by eagles and ravens. Efficient? Sure, but not exactly nutrient-rich for the surrounding ecosystem. Bears changed the game. When a brown bear catches a salmon, it doesn't eat the whole thing. Bears are picky. They eat the brain, the eggs, and maybe some of the fatty tissue. Then they ditch the rest. That half-eaten carcass? Gold. For the forest. Literally. Scientists who studied the valley in later years found something shocking. Trees growing within 50 feet of salmon streams were growing 300% faster than trees further away. The nitrogen from decomposing salmon was acting like fertilizer on steroids. More trees meant more shade. More shade meant cooler water. Cooler water meant better conditions for salmon. The salmon population exploded. By 1955, the salmon runs had nearly doubled. More food meant healthier bears. Healthier bears meant more cubs. The population wasn't just growing anymore, it was accelerating. But the bears weren't the only ones cashing in on the salmon buffet. Eagles showed up in numbers nobody had seen before. Golden eagles. Even the occasional osprey. Gulls and ravens formed what can only be described as an avian mob scene during peak salmon season. One biologist counted over 200 eagles in a single stretch of river. That's not a gathering. That's a convention. Then came the scavengers. Wolverines started showing up around 1956. These things are like honey badgers on a caffeine bender. They're tough, territorial, and absolutely fearless. They'd wait for bears to finish with the salmon, then move in for the leftovers. Sometimes they didn't even wait. There are reports of wolverines chasing bears off kills. Imagine being a 700-pound apex predator and getting punked by a 40-pound weasel with anger issues. Wolves arrived around the same time. Nobody relocated wolves. They showed up on their own, probably following the same logic as everyone else. Free food, minimal competition, plenty of prey. Wolf packs established territories throughout the valley. And unlike the bears, wolves hunt year-round. Moose, caribou, mountain goats. If it had 4 legs and looked tasty, wolves were interested. The moose population, ironically, was doing fine. You'd think more predators equals fewer prey animals. Bears are opportunistic. They'll take a moose calf if it's easy. But mostly they're focused on salmon, berries, and roots. Wolves. But they also cull the weak and sick animals, which keeps the herd healthy. By 1960, the valley was unrecognizable. Predator-free zone. Now, it was a fully functioning ecosystem, with a who's who of North American megafauna. Brown bears, black bears, wolves, wolverines, lynx, eagles, salmon, moose, caribou. Even grizzlies started wandering in from neighboring territories. But here's the kicker. The bear population had grown to an estimated 300 individuals. That's 25 times the original number. And they weren't struggling. They were thriving. Biologists studying the valley found that the bears there were healthier, had more cubs, and lived longer than bears in other parts of Alaska. The valley had become a brown bear paradise. Scientists started calling it the Lazarus Valley. Not officially, but the name stuck in certain circles. The idea being that this place had died ecologically, and then came back to life. All because someone had the crazy idea to drop a bunch of bears in the middle of nowhere. Now you might be wondering, okay, cool story. But what does this actually prove? Great question. Because the implications of what happened in that valley rippled way beyond Alaska. First off, it proved that apex predators aren't just important, they're essential. Remove them, and ecosystems don't just decline. They collapse in ways that aren't obvious until it's too late. The salmon were always there. The berries were always there. But without predators moving nutrients around, cycling energy through the system, the whole thing was stuck in neutral. Second, it showed that rewilding works. Not always, not everywhere, but under the right conditions you can hit reset on an ecosystem. This was one of the first large-scale examples of predator reintroduction, and it worked better than anyone expected. It became a template for future efforts. Wolves in Yellowstone? That started as a conversation informed partly by what happened in Alaska. Lynx reintroduction in Colorado? Same deal. Third, and this is the wild part, the valley became more resilient. In 1964, a massive earthquake hit Alaska. The Good Friday earthquake. Magnitude 9.2. Second most powerful earthquake ever recorded. It devastated parts of the state. Infrastructure collapsed. Entire towns were leveled. And this valley? It shook, sure, Landslides happened, rivers shifted course. But the ecosystem barely blinked. Why? Because it was robust. It had redundancy. If one salmon stream got blocked, bears moved to another. If a landslide wiped out a den site, wolves found new territory. The system could absorb shocks because it wasn't fragile anymore. Diversity creates resilience. Remove diversity, and you're one disaster away from collapse. By the 1970s, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game was getting questions from other states and even other countries. Everyone wanted to know how they pulled it off. What was the secret? And the answer was almost disappointing in its simplicity. There was no secret. They just put the right animals in the right place and got out of the way. But there were lessons. You can't just drop predators anywhere and hope for the best. The valley worked because it had food, water, shelter, and space. The prey base was there. The habitat was intact. If any of those pieces had been missing, the whole thing could have failed. And it almost did fail early on. If those first 12 bears hadn't reproduced, if the salmon runs hadn't been strong enough, it would have been a footnote in a failed experiment. There's also the human element. The valley was remote enough that human-bear conflicts were minimal. Nobody was living there. No farms, no ranches, no towns. The bears didn't have to compete with people for space or resources. That's a luxury most reintroduction efforts don't have. Fast forward to today. The valley is still thriving. The bear population has stabilized at around 400 individuals. That's near carrying capacity for the habitat, which means the ecosystem has hit equilibrium. Births roughly equal deaths. Immigration roughly equals emigration. It's a sign of health. Tourists occasionally visit, though it's not easy to get there. You need a bush plane or a serious commitment to hiking. Wildlife photographers love it. Imagine trying to capture a brown bear catching salmon with a bald eagle dive bombing the same fish. It's chaos. Beautiful, violent, chaotic nature doing its thing. But here's what most people don't realize. This experiment almost didn't happen. In the planning stages, there was serious pushback. Some officials thought it was too expensive. Others worried about bears spreading into nearby communities. A few thought the whole idea was doomed from the start. If the right people hadn't fought for it, those bears never would have been relocated. And this valley would still be a shadow of what it could be. That's the thing about conservation. It's not always obvious what will work. Sometimes you have to take risks. Sometimes you have to try things that sound crazy. Because doing nothing, that's a risk too. The Lazarus Valley, as some still call it, stands as a testament to what happens when you give nature the pieces it needs and then step back. The bears didn't just survive. They transformed an entire landscape. They brought life back to a place that had forgotten what a healthy ecosystem looked like. And the craziest part, this wasn't some billion-dollar initiative with cutting-edge technology and years of planning. This was a handful of wildlife officers with tranquilizer darts, some cargo planes, and a whole lot of hope. They released hundreds of bears into an empty valley, and the wildlife explosion that followed. It shocked everyone, because nobody expected nature to bounce back that hard, that fast, or that completely. So next time someone tells you apex predators are optional, that ecosystems can function fine without them, or that rewilding is some hippie fantasy that doesn't work, tell them about Alaska. Tell them about a valley that came back from the dead. Tell them about the bears that made it happen. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. If you enjoyed the story, consider subscribing. And if you've got thoughts on rewilding, conservation, or just want to share your own bear story, drop a comment. I'll see you in the next one.